Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Mohamed Bouabdallah. I'm the director of Villa Albertine and the Cultural Counselor of France in the US. I am honored to be here with you tonight and to celebrate the Albertine Translation grantees and the two laureates of the Albertine Translation Prize. And for me, it's a special moment because I'm with publishers, translators, and as a career diplomat, I try to translate between our two countries. And sometimes it's difficult, even painful, if you see what I mean in our today's world, but that's more than ever necessary. And before I start, I would like to thank our partner, because we would not be gathered here tonight without the support of our partners, Cleef and Arpels, and Julie Kramp, who is with us and will speak after me, and the Florence Gould Foundation, our long-term partner for the translation of French books in the US. And it is thanks to their generosity and trust that we have been able to make Albertine Translation such an impactful program. And I would like also to thank the members of the Albertine Translation Committee, some of whom are here tonight with us, for their dedication and hard work to help us select the best books for our program. In 2024, we supported 18 book projects through the Albertine Translation Fund, which is our part of our effort to promote literary and intellectual exchanges between France and the US. This program, formerly known as Albertine Voices, now Albertine Translation, has succeeded in establishing itself as a reference and an important resource for translators and publishers working to adapt books from French to English, whether in fiction, non-fiction, poetry, and children's book. And Villa Albertine is proud to play this role, this important role, in bringing the best contemporary French and Francophone literature to the US. And now, more than ever, we wish to emphasize our commitment, our strong commitment to helping those who, like translators and publishers, work hard to circulate ideas across borders, to challenge audiences and to give authors a voice outside of their communities. Because as you know, in a market that overwhelmingly focuses on domestic authors and references, it is a bold choice to choose authors and books from other countries. And it is particularly important today when we see societies being divided and countries being divided. And so the Albertine Translation Prizes is, in a way, a testimony of our admiration and gratitude to translators. And each year, thanks to the support of Cleef and Arpels, we reward 2 translators for their work, for their outstanding work, one in fiction, one in non-fiction, for the quality, the exceptional quality of the translation. And so it will be revealed in a few minutes by Ed. And I would like to thank you very much, Ed. You are a senior international editor at Publishers Weekly, and thank you very much for being our host tonight. And I would like also to thank the members of the panel, of the discussion and the roundtable that will follow the announcements. So before handing over the stage to Ed, that will be our Master of Ceremony, I would like to welcome Julie Kramp, Vice President of Marketing and Communications at Cleef and Arpels. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohamed, and good evening, everyone. I'm Julie Kramp, the Vice President of Marketing and Communications at Cleef and Arpels. And this is a really treasured tradition of mine, this prize that we have been supporting since 2017. A really important moment in these cross-cultural exchanges that, as a French maison with deep roots in the Americas since the late 1920s, we really understand and value the importance of cross-cultural enrichment. Literature is a very important source of inspiration for the maison, whether it's the work of Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, or Midsummer Night's Dream, or Plato, or even more recently, Robert Louis Stevenson. We find great inspiration in the work of these authors and take great pleasure in translating their work and their stories into pieces of jewelry. So it is only natural for us to support this prize and to continue this tradition. So without further ado, I will hand the floor to Ed and for a very enriching conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out this evening. It's an exciting moment whenever you can honor a translator and the work that they have chosen to dedicate their life to offer cross-cultural conversations. And as noted, I work at Publishers Weekly. We're a 153-year-old magazine for the book business, and translation has garnered a greater deal of attention in the last 15 to 20 years in the US, and this is something that, I think that organizations like the French Consulate and Villa Albertine have been very important and instrumental in promoting, and I think that itself deserves a round of applause. So, thank you very much. So, let's not delay too long. Without further ado, I'm happy to announce the winner of the Albertine Translation Prize in the nonfiction category. And this is the first laureate of this translation prize for nonfiction. And this will go to Gregory Elliott for his translation of Frédéric Gros' Pourquoi, guerre, and the book will be published by Verso in the United States. Since Gregory is based in the UK, he can't be with us tonight. We're going to welcome Gray Anderson to the stage to accept the award on his behalf.
Thanks so much. So Gregory sends his regrets, but he's written a few remarks that I'll deliver on his behalf. Have no fear, I'm going to keep this brief so that you can proceed to the enjoyable part of the evening. Translators, nonfiction translators in particular, tend to remain invisible unless, or should I say until, they get it wrong. On occasion, this can feel unjust, but since I've certainly got things wrong and got away with it, I'm not complaining, especially in view of the well-known fact that translators, myself included, are often the sternest critics, not of their own work, naturally, but of other translators. To prove the point, risking retaliation, I'll take the liberty of citing my favorite mistranslation, namely of Louis Althusser's conception of history as un procès sans sujet, a process without a subject, as a trial without a subject, Althusserian equivalent, perhaps, of Kafka's trial without an object. This only goes to show, I think, that of the three skills demanded of a translator, competence in the relevant foreign language, the ability to write decent English, and a working knowledge of the subject matter, the last is by no means the least. One reason I recently turned down the offer of a book on the AI by which some publishing conglomerates will sooner or later doubtless seek to replace the likes of me and my fellow prize winner, whom I take the opportunity to congratulate. Anyway, on a more positive note, it's all the more gratifying to receive some recognition now, because my first prize for translation will also be my last. For the simple reason that it happens to coincide with my impending retirement after 25 years working as a translator, principally from French, occasionally from Italian. Most of this work has been with Verso, from Althusser's Machiavelli and Us, whose title speaks for itself, in 1999, to Didier Fassin's Moral Abdication, just published, on Israel's obliteration of Gaza. I would like to thank Verso, with whom my association as an employee, short-lived, author, editor, and translator dates back to the mid-1980s, for enabling me to earn a living outside the degraded precincts of the education formerly known as higher. Given the way of the world, it feels appropriate to be acknowledged for Frédéric Gros' stimulating set of reflections on Pourquoi, guerre, due to appear later this year, which I actually completed before the Fassin text, but which forms a perfect companion to it. Let me conclude by expressing my sincere gratitude, first and foremost, obviously, to the judges of the Albertine Foundation for the honor they have done me in awarding this prize, and to the unintended stimulus provided by a Latin teacher who reported in 1977 that, I quote, "Gregory's undoubted literary gifts do not transfer to foreign languages." Thanks.
Well, that's a hard act to follow. The only of the three qualities he's missing is perhaps courage, because I think translation does take a degree of courage. And on that note, I'm now happy to announce the second laureate for the Albertine Translation Prize. It goes to Eve Hill-Agnus for her translation of Mariette Navarro's Ultramarins. This will be published in the US by Deep Vellum Books of Dallas, Texas later this year. Welcome. I forgot. We have a special video from Ms. Navarro prior to your speech.
Hello, I'm Mariette Navarro, and I really wanted to congratulate Eve for this wonderful award and for her translation of Ultramarin, my book. I'm very lucky. This book is a kind of magic. I'm very lucky because since it was published in France, it keeps traveling all over the world and meeting wonderful people. Really, thank you to make this possible. And I also wanted to say that for me, translators are the best readers in the world because they notice details and they know secrets about my book that I don't even know myself because they make a really hard work about details, and thank you for this. And congratulations again from the other side of the ocean.
And now, Eve.
Good evening, everyone. I first of all want to say it's a tremendous honor to be here, and I want to thank the Villa Albertine and the judges and everyone who's been involved in making this possible. Because really, it's tremendously important to believe in the idea that allowing for works in translation to be available is part of what makes us our world and our perspectives richer and bigger. So again, thank you so much. I also am tremendously grateful because this translation, I think, rewards a practice of risk-taking and firsts, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But I want to say in sort of in reply to Mariette, and I wish she were here to hear me say so, but I came to this work because it mesmerized me, and I proposed it because I was totally smitten by its poetry and also by its subject. So for anyone who hasn't read it, and I know it's not available for another month or so, but the work is a beautiful and short, very spare novel in which a female captain of a cargo ship crosses the Atlantic, or we find her in the middle of the Atlantic crossing with a crew of 20 men that requests in the middle of the first page to cut the engines and go for a swim, which is completely against protocol. And from that moment, everything sort of unfurls. The men go for a swim. They experience extreme vertigo and a sort of existential moment of disorientation that Mariette describes gorgeously, with a lot of abstract images. And when they get back on the ship, there are 21 of them instead of 20. And I think it's an interesting and very experimental work in that I've described it as a psychological thriller in which nothing really happens. You can't stop reading it, and at the same time, you're not sure if there is a plot, if it's simply a psychological tale that's happening in the protagonist's head, but and the protagonist has no name. You're completely riveted from the beginning. I read it in one take and immediately wrote to Will at Deep Vellum and said, we have to do this. And I'm extremely grateful, again, that he took a risk. It was my first full-length translation, and I'd been working with Deep Vellum and doing some copy editing and second reads for French works in translation, to have that kind of second read and edit that would be bring a certain, I'm Franco-American, French was my first language, so that would bring that kind of awareness to the second read, and I had enjoyed that very much, but it still was still a risk for him to propose, to accept a book that was Mariette's first novel and my first novel as a translator. Mariette's background is in theater. She's a playwright, and also in poetry, which I didn't know actually when I started. I simply responded to the work. My background is in literature and in poetry, and so I think there was something in the kind of in the fated in that that her work would speak so much to me. And as a work of translation, I think it was very interesting that we actually live in Paris, about a 15-minute walk from one another, which we discovered kind of late in the process. But and so she told me that she set herself very particular constraints when she wrote this novel, and it's a very strange novel. And I love that because I set constraints for myself as a translator when I approached the novel, and I decided that the most important thing would be the sound, which is what had really struck me from the beginning, and that my task would be to translate the sound of the ocean that she recreates in her language, and the rhythms that she recreates in the language, not only in the scenes with water, that would be easy, but in the entire novel. And she does this through the way that she casts her sentences and in so many ways. And so I decided that was the most important thing, and then I just went about figuring out a methodology to do that, and drawing very much on my own poetic background. So it felt like essentially writing a poem the entire time, so finding all the different ways in which internal sounds and alliterations and various things could begin to create a music that wouldn't be the exact music in French, but when I heard it in my inner ear, I had a feeling in my body and in myself that matched what I felt when I read her words in French. And so I just went through doing that. No one had ever said that was a method for anything, and so I just trusted my instinct. And so to have the committee, the Ville Albertine, and everyone who's been involved in the process reward that and see that is tremendously humbling. And again, it all feels like people allowing us in the creative sphere to take a leap of faith. Finally, I just want to say that it's a subject that I think is really important. It deals with, a woman in a sphere that is mostly a male sphere. That obviously is very current. I also feel that there's sort of something in the air with the ocean. So I've been talking with people who know the book and people who have read The Galleys, and everyone seems to resonate with the book. So I certainly hope that everyone will, read it, and that this kind of literature can continue to be shared in other cultures. And as Mariette Navarro said, it's hopefully this will continue to build bridges, between cultures. So thank you so much.
Thank you for your lovely thoughts and your thoughtful comments. We're going to take now some time, and we're going to get everybody up on stage, and we have a panel set up, and we're going to have a conversation about the art and business of translation. So give us 1 minute, and we'll get ourselves organized. So please. So at risk of offending anybody by mispronouncing their name, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask everybody to remind everybody who they are and give us just a 1 or 2 sentence description about what your role is professionally as it relates to literary translation. And we'll start with, actually, why don't we start here on my right?
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine. I publish under C. Francis Fisher for confusing reasons we might go into later. And I'm a translator, and then I also run a translation reading series here in New York, sponsored by my publisher, World Poetry Books, and called Colloquy.
Hello, I'm Alessandra, and I was invited because I'm on the jury, and I'm representing the jury. I'm a professor at the University of Amsterdam, but I also continue to teach at the City College of New York because I adore the City College of New York.
Hi, I'm Gray. I'm an editor at Verso Books, where I acquire and edit works of translation, chiefly nonfiction, history, and social theory.
I'm Eve Hill-Agnus, and I'm a writer, and I also translate from French to English.
Well, why don't we begin, and I think, since this is about the prize, let's talk a little bit about the panel. Can you tell us a little bit about the process that you went through in selecting the winners for this year, and could you describe that to us? Because I think that often these prizes, they feel like they come out of the blue, the process is sometimes opaque, and then suddenly we have an announcement of a winner. So take us through that process a little bit briefly.
Well, I guess first I'll say it'll make sense. I'm somebody who always thanks people, but it fits in a sense. I think I've been doing this for I don't even know how long now, and we are really friends, kin. I know your book just came out on kinship and intellectualisms, and I think that is really crucial to what it is we do, and alongside with the team at the French embassy. And I think that's really important because now that I live in Amsterdam and I worked for the French for a long time, I think this idea of taking a book that exists in one public sphere with all of its vexed issues and transferring it into another public sphere, as much as the problems might seem the same, like I think about Jewish studies, or I think about all sorts of things that come up. What does it mean to transfer something into another public sphere? It's extremely delicate, it's extremely dangerous, and without a group of people that care about that book and care about the author and care about the translator, there's absolutely no way that it could transfer in a smooth way or in such a way that we know what might come up. And I loved how you spoke about this sort of embodiedness, that it really, what comes into that final product in the target language of the translation is so many, it's almost a choreography, it's a dance that is now being shown to the public. And I think without a team that can comfortably disagree and that cares about each other, it's really hard not to.
How many people were on the panel?
I don't know, we have to ask Laure. I think we're about 12. Combien? A dozen.
A dozen. And do you remember how many titles you considered?
Myself, individually, or
Yeah,
together?
well, that'll give you a sense of, yeah.
Oh, all of us, I think we consider about 60 a year, something like that. It depends.
So it's a significant number of
Yeah.
books that you're distilling down into this one single prize winner. And you talk about moving the book between different public spheres. To what extent, I'm curious from your point of view, working as you do as a poet and running a series, so you're working across different languages. I tend to describe translation as cultural diplomacy. What you're doing is you're making decisions to depict another culture, to choose books or representations of another culture, to translate them into another culture. So in this case, it's French to English. In other contexts, it's German to French. It's Polish to Japanese. So often this plays a role. Japan and Korea, for example, have a significant cultural exchange. How does that strike you, this idea of cultural diplomacy, and how does that impact your kind of thinking when you're curating your own reading series?
That's a great question. I think I'm gonna sidestep it by saying that one of the things that I'm really interested in are poets who write in adopted languages, or also novelists who write in adopted languages. French has been a language for a long time that people who are not necessarily native speakers of that language have adopted for various reasons, some of which are certainly, colonial and fraught, and others of which are maybe a sort of love story for a language. And so I think that there's a way in which yes, literature always is, materially conditioned. It's coming out of a certain set of possibilities, but there are also writers who shake that up quite a bit. So the poet who I translated, Joyce Mansour, she grew up speaking English and grew up in Egypt, and then chose to move to Paris to join the Surrealist movement because that sort of revolutionary ethos really resonated with her. And that's why she chose French as her sort of adopted language. I think in terms of what you were saying about the reading series, what's amazing about translation is that the finished product exists in English, something that whoever is coming to the series likely speaks. And so it is this way that we can all talk about this particular piece of literature without needing to know the original language. And so in that way, I think that it is a bridge, as we talked about earlier. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, kind of. You sidestepped it very well. No, so just so I get this clear, she was born speaking, English was her first language, she adopted French, and you're translating it back into English.
Yes, which is something that I have a very fraught relationship with. I don't know if I'm ready to talk about that one. She did some of her own self-translations as well. She rarely wrote in English, although there are a few poems that she wrote in English that are not as good as her poems written in French. I think there's a way that writing in your non-native language can sort of estrange you.
Beckett would say the same thing,
right? Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Somebody else who adopted
This is great
French.
because with AI translation, we're all going to be retranslating AI into something that we are happy that we want to read, because a lot of it's garbage. But let's talk, so we're talking a little bit about translation. Let's talk about Ultramarine, because one of the nuances of your work is, and you mentioned this in this acceptance speech, was that the book is itself about a woman talking about herself being in the milieu of men. And does that, because French is very sensitive to the sexes, it's very sensitive to the different genders, and everything is gendered. Can you talk about how that maybe changed or impacted your translation back into English, which does tend to flatten these aspects of the language? Sorry, that was a bit maybe out of the blue, but it just struck me when you were speaking earlier. I thought that would be interesting to talk about.
No, I think it's a really interesting question. Mariette Navarro was not sure at the beginning if the crew would be all female or all male. And so she, and the female captain didn't exist in the beginning. So that was a later addition. The first scene was actually the crew swimming, and so and she realized as she was thinking about that she really wanted the image of this people swimming. She wanted that image, which is very visual and very beautiful, the way she describes it being traced on the horizon, and she wanted that to be observed from above. And so she needed a character who would do that. And so she just had it was like a flash, and she saw the figure of a woman smoking a cigarette on the deck of the ship, and that was her main character. So then the crew became all male. And one of the constraints, and she was telling me all this after the fact. I didn't want to ask her these questions beforehand. I didn't want to know all of I just asked her really specific questions about sections I was wondering about, but all of this we talked about later. But one of the constraints was that she didn't want to have the captain have a name. And because every time she tried to give her a name, and then every time she had a name, it became too much of just a story, a concrete story, a plot that was tethered to the here and now, and she really wanted it to feel a little bit dreamlike, which it does, and strange and almost metaphysical at times. And so this kind of becoming detached from gender or from, from those dichotomies that you're talking about, those binaries in the language, was really important to her. And so, and even without knowing that, I had definitely picked up in the language that she uses the construction on a lot, which is the impersonal kind of construction, which in English, the closest would be like one does this. In English, that's terribly formal, and in French, it's not. So one was out. Like, there was no way I was going to go through the whole novel being like, one, it would just feel weird, weirdly like a... Anyway, of course, it's wrong. So, so then I just had to come up with ways to skirt that and to create these sentences that are strangely ambiguous, that kind of take on these shapes that are slightly untethered in various ways, and I just had to do something that did that. And a lot of the time, the something would become the subject, and it was actually like an object or some entity in in the sentence would. Anyway, it was something that I really, really thought about and wrestled with a lot, because it was very slippery. She really, really wants to avoid exactly that, like that thing that for the French language kind of forces you to do.
Well, it's interesting because it brings to mind there's another novel, which I believe is French, but again, it's under pressure here, but I Who Have Not Known Men, which is quite a extraordinary, I believe it's Swiss if I'm not mistaken, but also an unnamed female narrator, which becomes, it's becoming more and more prevalent. And I'm curious because you referenced how you have used, you have changed your full name to using something shorter. And I'm curious just maybe why is this happening right now in this moment? And then I'm going to get to Verso, because I think this is about politics, but please do.
I wish I had a more exciting answer for you.
Shoot.
There's another Catherine Fisher who is a writer.
Oh, drat. All right.
But no, I think people definitely assume that, yeah, there's something going on.
That there's a political agenda
Yes.
behind it, yes.
And, that's okay.
It doesn't hurt, though. Yeah. Let people question. And so from the perspective of Verso, you're commissioning work specifically, and you're picking out of the French culture to present to Americans. Is it my impression that Verso has always been somewhat of an activist publishing house? And how is that playing a role today? I mean, do you have a position that you guys take on, for example, this political moment in time?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would say activist, but Verso has always sought to publish critical books from a broad, non-sectarian left-wing perspective. So at its origins, when Verso was New Left Books, at the turn of the 70s, this consisted in translating the kind of foundational works of Western Marxism. So Della Volpe, Althusser, Adorno, and so forth. That canon, in a sense, having been now made available to an English-speaking readership, we seek to, in a sense, both kind of continue that vocation, that is to say, find major works of social theory, critical political texts, sometimes punctual interventions, translate those, and also sort of use translation, not just from French, but although we are, I think, kind of predominantly translating from French, but from other languages as well, use that as an opportunity to kind of broaden the list. And so I think that although the priority is on critical and sometimes engaged text, there isn't one single line pursued by the House. I think it's, we try to be, in a sense, Catholic in that respect. I mean, I think, one of the challenges associated with that, and this is a challenge that was evoked earlier that I think concerns translation, of all kinds of different texts, is essentially contextualizing those books that we do put out, because we seek in particular, I think, to translate books which address debates or concepts which are not familiar, in the Anglosphere. And by definition, that means, having to kind of, in a sense, introduce the framework in which these particular debates make sense. And I think, in the States in particular, we can think of examples of that type of interpretation or reception that have been skewed or queered in one way or another. I mean, I suppose what's called French theory, might be one such case. And so I guess that
which is not always a positive when you're walking into a bookstore and the French theory section is not necessarily front and center on the table, Barnes and Noble.
As Baudrillard said, that like the Statue of Liberty, it was a gift from France to America that we did not want or need.
Well, let's talk about the book that won this particular prize. What was the decision-making behind this book at this time?
So I myself, I have to say, joined Verso relatively recently. I didn't acquire the Frédéric Gros title that was translated by Gregory Elliott, but this is not the first book of his that we've published. His Philosophy of Walking was a great success on a quite different, of course, theme, kind of perhaps more congenial theme, but I think he's an excellent example, of someone who is kind of keeping alive a tradition of politically engaged, theoretically ambitious, in his case, of kind of Foucauldian inflection research, which, is also in a style, written in a style that I think is admired greatly in France and has a real wide readership there, but that in the States, is not so immediately familiar. And so, we've been proud to be able to make those titles available and see them find a kind of readership.
So part of the practicality of choosing books for translation is also you want a certain degree of novelty, and novelty not just for the sake of curiosity, but for advancing the culture in some meaningful way, where you can bring a new style, a new field of thought, if you will, or perspective to another culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I would really put
That's
the emphasis...
grandiose, but...
No, but I'll accept it. I mean, I think that element of, like, estrangement is really important, in particular, amidst a kind of, homogenization of intellectual and cultural life, all across the North Atlantic zone, and, decline of competence in foreign languages and so on. I mean, there are plenty of books published in France or, all over the place, which essentially echo themes that are being produced in one instance or another, in the kind of, metropolitan, that is to say, U.S.-American core about, any number of subjects. I think those are kind of less interest to us than books which really, introduce a kind of new perspective or familiar themes in an unconventional way.
And Alessandra, having moved from you're working between multiple worlds. I mean, New York, Amsterdam, and then French culture are three distinct spheres, if you will. What have you found has been the differences between the three?
Yeah, as I was thinking today, and over the years of being on the committee, as especially moving to the Netherlands and working there, it strikes me how little we know till we are in, not just sort of in. Like the years I spent summers in France or a year abroad. And when we're really in the thick of a organizational, institutional culture that has governments and its specific problems, it's then that we realize how delicate everything is. And I think this is what everyone on our committee brings, is this capacity to live in various worlds. And that itself is this, just listening to what everything is being said as well. So a friend of mine and I just co-authored an article on Tracy Chapman and why we adore Tracy Chapman. And she's a professor turned Haitian studies and was a voice vocalist before blues. And we got into this conversation about what's the difference between folk artists and blues. And then we came across a rather old text about the crossroads. So both of us do Haitian studies. And the crossroads is where, in Vodou, for example, or many Africana-derived spiritual systems, one is mounted by another spirit. And it really hit me that a lot of the conversations about translation are about the untranslatability. And listening to you speak, and even the words that you brought to us in your own mounted way, is that the blues singer is different than all other singers because they do this. They, in the words of Houston A. Baker, more clearly adhere to a codifying force. And in that codifying force, they are able to distill at the crossroads what is happening. So I think a translator at some level is a person who translates cannot be the person who wrote. And what you just gave the example. At some level, they're creating something new, like your Bowie, that was really interesting, your Bowie article. And I think that idea of codifying force, that brings a mystical role into something that allows us in society to deal with the present conjuncture. What is the mysticism that we need in all of its non-spiritual way or non-religious way, but in a very secular way. And I think that, like, listening to you talk about constraints, experiment, it was just really exciting, or how you were speaking about what it is for you to translate in English in your way versus her way. It's really exciting. So I think that's what living in between spaces, we become more and more and more subtle about that crossroads.
So because we're here in celebration of a prize, which has monetary value attached to it, that's intended to facilitate more translation, let me start from my right and just ask each of you, what is it you find you need materially to feel supported as a translator? I mean, what's the expectation? Because I think when we talk, I'm privy to some of the contracts and the deals, and these are relatively modest sums of money to try to live on. So let's talk about that. You know, how does one persist without just grinding out a lot of work, or what do you feel to need supported, or to feel as if it's a viable profession or occupation?
I mean, it's not. In our current ecosystem, it's absolutely not a viable profession, and that is at the great loss of literature. Yeah. So it's hard for me to even imagine what that would look like. I mean, most translators are academics, or they have a day job, or they're editors, or, everybody has another job. So, and now we have no grant money either. So even those places that, are supporting translators to some small extent, I don't know how they'll do it now. So yeah, sorry to ring that sad bell, but.
So I mean, because prizes like this and programs like that of which the Villa Albertine is a part, and the French government supports, and this goes to other nations. I mean, Philly, which is the Finnish Literary Exchange, Norla, the Norwegian, program that supports literature. These are essential to maintaining translators. Is that an accurate assessment from your point of view, having your experience working in the industry?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. When I first I've been in and out of academia, and I worked as the fundraiser here, up in the office on the 3rd floor.
Oh, okay, so you
so
know
I know
firsthand.
I'm very grateful, incredibly grateful. But to answer your question, I think, especially since AI has come up, is Caribbean philosopher Sylvia Winters talks about homo narrans. We can't live without narrative. We can't live without stories. And whether they're jewelry or books or video games or whatever, AI can't do that. It can reproduce, it can put facts in order, it can create subject, verb, object, but it can't tell stories that are meaningful to us at this moment, how we need them to process what we're going through. And it just won't disappear, but it does need to be recompensed because it's magical what you do versus what Google Translate does. I mean, there's magic and mysticism in it. So important.
I mean, sadly, I will tell you the truth. I interviewed an AI-generated author today for the first time at the behest of Storytel, which is a very large Swedish company that has a huge interest in a company called Nuanced, which does automated translation. And it was eerie and unsettling, and they were weirdly articulate because, of course, they're drawing from the answers of thousands of other much more intelligent actual human beings.
But is articulate telling a story?
No, it's oddly cold, and you know, they had written a young adult romantasy novel, simultaneously published in 6 languages, which is also terrifying. But so on that note, at Verso, I mean, what is your expectation when you go into an acquisition process? Are you taking pitches from translators? Are you taking pitches from the authors themselves? And you know, what process are you going through when you make a decision to do that? How important is the promise of support for that translation to that decision-making process as well?
Well, at Verso, I mean, we're proud to publish, I think it's something like 20% of the list consists in books in translation, which for a relatively small independent house is a challenge. And so we really are very grateful for and dependent on you know, grants and external funding. When it comes to actually acquiring books to publish in translation, sometimes they come to us through the translators, sometimes through the authors, and I think in particular, and this is particularly true in France, we really you know, kind of benefit from close relations with French publishing houses that share, you know, a sort of similar kind of sense of political mission.
For example?
La Fabrique would be one. It was a small publishing house, but we, in fact, put out a fair number of their titles in English, and they do likewise. They publish French translations of Verso books frequently. La Découverte would be another example, or Édition Agone. So I would say those are the 3 main sources, you know, and often, of course, you know, when it comes to languages which are not spoken by many people on the editorial committee, we'll find external readers, you know, often academics, not always, to produce reports and you know, sort of educate ourselves that way.
Excellent. And your translation, as you alluded to, came to some extent because of your direct relationship with a publisher that already existed. So you said that you had not, this is your first literary translation, but you had the confidence in part because you knew you could trust the publisher and the publisher trusted you. And could you explicate that a little bit and unpack that? Would you have been as motivated if you hadn't had that door open to you already?
I think, yeah, I was very motivated to see if I could get this book translated into English because I felt like, well, yeah.
It had to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it just...
There's an inevitability to the right
yeah,
book.
it just had to be read by an English-speaking audience. So I was committed to that. I think, you know, if Will hadn't agreed to let me translate it for Deep Vellum, I would have continued to try and find a place where I could get it translated. But I think that, you know, back to your original question about what translators need, I think I completely agree with Catherine that it is completely untenable as a full-time career. I have, really close friends in France who translate the other way around from English to French, and they can make careers of that. And thank you to the French government, and also to the fact that, for having rules about how much you should be paid, but also in France, it's such a huge share of the market. So here in America, it is really hard. So I think that you're never going to make a lot of money. I mean, we're probably making like 2 or 3 cents an hour, given how much goes into a translation. But what people can do, publishers and so on, is trust translators. When a translator brings a text, like Will did, give them the benefit of the doubt. I think it's hard because, often that publisher, that person, can't read the original text. Duh, that's why the translator's there. So, it's hard. They have to really believe that this can be something in English and is worthwhile and will contribute something. So I think trust. And then the one thing that I also received that I was really grateful for was help and a second reader. And so getting another translator on board, which is, yet again supporting translation. So I had a really wonderful, I got to pick my second reader as well from the Deep Vellum roster of translators who had already done works in French.
Who was that?
It was Katie Shireen Assef, and I had adored her translation of Forêt Noire. And so I said, do you think we could get her to do a second read? I feel like we have the same sensibility, similar sensibility. And her sensibility is different enough, though, that I knew she would be filling in some of the things that I was a little bit more nervous about. And I cannot express the importance of having somebody else read the work and push back and suggest other things, and it grew. I mean, it wouldn't be what it is without that. So that's another way that, and I think that's really hard because an award like the Albertine Fund isn't going to reward or make money available to the second read. So that's. I mean, we can't even address funding for the primary translator, let alone somebody who's going to do the second read. So I just think that there's so much that that a publisher is taking on when they decide to do works in translation, and the more we can also talk about those layers of need and those layers of work, and back to this question of AI. I mean, try and replicate that, these layers and layers of work and thought and time, and I just think, and exchange and debate over very tiny things. So, the more we talk about it, though, I think the more people will realize how important it is to fund these things through programs like this and through residencies and, time and space. So residencies for translation also, are really important.
It's very resource intensive, especially France benefits from the fact that its language has an enormous amount of respect as a literary medium historically. And so people have an interest in it, they're taught it, but then you have smaller nations, but then some of them are extraordinary at doing translation. I happen to be Maltese, and the Maltese joke, they're like, we have nothing for you, because there's no funding. It's a tiny little nation. But you go to Iceland, a nation almost exactly the same size and population, also a very isolated island. They've invested extraordinary amounts of money and effort into facilitating translation, including running schools to teach translators how to translate from Icelandic. That's why you know Icelandic writers and you do not know Maltese writers.
I would say also, with the benefit of a little bit of time and my other panelists' great answers, I think that the academic space could do a better job of rewarding translators. For example, a lot of universities don't recognize translations as publications for tenure-track jobs. And I think the sort of built-in assumption there is that translation is not, in fact, a creative act. It's a sort of secondary act to to the original work, which I think any translator would vehemently disagree with. And then also, I mean, in terms of the PhD space, you know, allowing people to turn in translations as their dissertations. I think some sort of changes, and I think these things are changing slowly, and at certain universities and not others. But I think the academic space could also do a lot more to support translators.
Is that because there's a sense that it's not an original creation, though
Yes.
you all have described how very much it is an original translation, or creation? Yeah. And I'm curious, for people who aspire to be translators and publishers who aspire to facilitate more translation, what would you like to see change about the way that the process of the industry supports you as a translator? What would make things easier for you?
I'm not a translator, but I think
Or in the
observing
field?
over, yeah. I mean, I feel you've sort of brought it up in your question. The last years have been so difficult politically, and I think what I've noticed on the committee is can be such a subtle choice for someone to turn in a translation of a certain book. So the choice that they make to even choose to translate, there's one choice, and then the choice that are made by the translator and the choice that we make as a jury. I think to move a discussion just a little bit in a way that we might not have expected, to ask a question like, Pourquoi la guerre, and not which guerre is the right guerre. I mean, just these subtle movements allow us to reshape how we ask questions and think about each other. So I would kind of leave it at that.
Translation is an interesting moment because we're looking at a world which has numerous wars and conflicts, and you can see where there's a lot of tension. You know, for example, in the Francophone world, there is a lot of tension within, you know, former colonies of France and how the languages are translated. And as verso, because you address this often in your publications, how does this political moment speak to your mission and the mission of translation? And I say this, you know, I routinely deal with, I was on the phone with an Israeli agent 2 days ago who said, we're like the peanut of the book world, because if somebody touches us, they're afraid they're going to die. Russian publishers, for example, have had extremely hard time getting any attention or anyone to speak to them. I mean, and that's on the negative side. You know, I happen to be somebody on the opposite side of both of those ideas. But I'm curious, as verso, how do you address this political moment when you're making decisions about translation, seeking support? And do you seek out those perhaps contrarian views on something as politically, politically contentious as Gaza, Ukraine, Algeria?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So we actually have a series of pamphlets on Palestine that were commissioned and following the October 7th attacks and its aftermath, and that have just now appeared in print or will be appearing soon, which are sharp, very trenchant, politically engagé works, you know, from a variety of different perspectives, but not shying any sense away from controversy or condemning Israel's Vernichtungskrieg. I think, you know, in other parts of the world, it certainly is a challenge, also finding authors in some cases. So I think, for instance, of, you know, the People's Republic of China, where over the past decade and a half, it has been difficult, in fact, to find authors, you know, who sort of feel sufficiently free to speak their minds from you know, one vantage or another. So, you know, I think that's a kind of wider challenge or obstacle, but you know, one that we try to surmount insofar as possible.
So in some ways, translation is very much in support of the freedom to publish movement and stands in opposition to the movements to challenge free speech.
Yeah, I think we have utter contempt for censorship. You know.
Boom. Exactly. Go ahead. Clap for that one. Yeah. Okay. Well, we have only just a few minutes left, and we don't want to keep everybody. Does anybody is eager to ask a question of one of our panelists? And I can bring the mic out to them or Does anybody in the audience? Or Laura will help us out. And don't be shy. Yes, please. And please introduce yourself. Let us know who you are and what brought you here tonight.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Cullen Shar from Dallas, Texas. Proud member of the Deep Vellum family. And listening to Catherine, especially tonight, wanted to ask a question to the translators. How you think about voices in French over time, and when they are translated, and by whom, and how that that affects the voice of the author in the original text.
It's a hard-hitting question. I'm really interested in the circulation of translated texts and how, so I translate a surrealist, and I think that in French, that sort of language and movement has a much larger cultural relevancy than it does in the United States. And so when you, and obviously there's plenty of French surrealists now who have been translated, but still it has this, a certain kind of new quality, I think, in English, that maybe it has a longer legacy in French. I don't know what we do with that as translators. You don't want to sort of domesticate the text and to make it, but I think that that's something, you know, a great publisher will let you write a translator's note, and that's kind of, I think, where you get to address those sorts of questions.
What about when there's a prior translation, if there's a prior translation?
So is the question, what does the translator do if a prior translation exists of the text?
What motivates you to freshen it up?
Yeah, I mean, I think on one hand, we need more translations of living authors, and you know, I'm somewhat of a hypocrite saying that because the person that I'm working on is not a living author, and there are some existing translations, but I think that texts also deserve to be retranslated because times change and the text changes and what it means to contemporary people changes. And I think that also I think that sometimes text has been translated not necessarily erroneously or wrong in a sort of literal sense, but I think all texts deserve multiple translations because the more versions of a text there are, the closer you come to something like an original, which is of course something impossible, but different translators can sort of pick up on different threads of an original text. So to me, the more versions, the better.
One might even argue that multiple translations of a book speaks to its longevity and its validity, and much in the same way you can go back. Somebody wants to find a classic as a book that you can return to at different stages of your life and get different meaning from that, much in the same way translations can be, books can be retranslated. We've seen that with Tolstoy. One of my favorite translations of the last 2 years or 3 years is a modern interpretation of Beowulf. Now, who would think that this needs to be translated? But it's done from a very feminist perspective, and the first words of the book are bro, because all of the drinking, Norsemen are bros, and it really gave me a new insight on that book. So, do we have other questions? I hope we do. Yes, please. And again, please tell us who you are and what brought you here tonight.
Yeah, hi. My name is Sue Goldman, and I'm part of the CUNY Graduate Center. I teach Japanese, and I read a great deal of Japanese to English translations. And once upon a time, a publisher like Knopf spent a very long time and was very generous with allowing translators to work slowly and efficiently. And now it seems to me that an awful lot is being churned out very quickly, and a great deal of fidelity is being lost in the translations. I'm a student of Donald Keene's, and Donald Keene was famous for his extraordinary English translations. He wrote in Japanese as well, but it was partly because he was a comparative literature major and had read extremely widely across European literature in the original and in translation. And I have the sense that young translators don't have this kind of background. So I'm addressing the publishing world. You know, I wonder how you, when you get a translation from a language you don't know, how you handle it.
Great.
Well, at Verso, I mean, we've been lucky to have several generations of really gifted translators, you know, who are also experts in the fields from which they translate. So in that sense, you know, I take very seriously your comment. I think it's absolutely true, and it, I think, will be difficult for those generations to replenish themselves, as has been mentioned. You know, the resources available to people working in the academy, and certainly those outside of the academy, are thinner and thinner on the ground. So I think, you know, that's a very real concern, to which I don't have an easy answer. I think also, I mean, others on the panel will know better than I, but I think one has to consider that translators, you know, require time to read and think about other things. It's not simply a question, as you rightly say, of simply, you know, being able to churn out a document, but also to be able to sort of read around and what have you. So, you know, I'm afraid that the future doesn't kind of augur well for the moment on any of those counts.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, absolutely. Here in the pink.
Hi, my name is Eva Reznikova. I worked at Knopf in the 80s. I worked on French translations with Judith Jones. Speaking of multiple translations, I wanted to ask also about American versus British, because at that time we got a new translation of L'Étranger from the British, and my job, my lowly job as a French major, was to Americanize it, because you couldn't have the guys on the truck coming back yelling from the football game, soccer game, yelling, "We thrashed them." So that's an issue as well that I wanted to bring up about British versus American, which are both English, and how you handle that. And also, I think multiple translations have to keep up with the times. I mean, you had Constance Garnett, who did what she did, which was wonderful at the time, and you know, you don't want to be satisfied with that, and it reflected the times, and it reflected the language of the times, and also the culture of the times.
I'll address that. So Ultramarine exists in two English language translations. It was translated into English for the British market separately from, and I know Corey Stockwell translated it for the British market, and then our translation exists for the American market. And I know that the British translation came out actually more swiftly, and it existed before I started translating myself. And so the rights were acquired more quickly and so on. And I didn't read it until I was done, but having read both, I mean, they feel very different. And that's partly, you know, I mentioned my emphasis and the primary goal that I had in translating, and which gave the work a certain color, and then Corey had another goal, I'm sure. But also, yeah, they're very different. The language is very different, and you're in a just slightly different world in the text. And strangely enough, it really does feel like you're in a slightly different world, as though those two ships exist. You know, they're crossing the Atlantic, but it's like they're crossing a different sea and in a whole different universe. And I find that fascinating, and so I think it's very valuable to have different translations in one language, and I think it would be terrible to try and sort of squish English, you know, have one for both markets. And I think, I mean, it would be really interesting to think about how that might apply to other contexts, right? I mean, like, should we have one French translation, for example? I mean, that is a whole other question. There's the Francophone world is so varied and diverse. So anyway, yeah, it's a really, really fascinating topic.
But only one of those translations won the Albertine Prize. We want to say thank you to all of our panelists tonight. And thank you to you. Lauren?
Thank you, everyone. Perfect note to end. Thank you. I wanted to congratulate on behalf of Villa Albertine, Eve Hill-Agnus for her translation of Mariette Navarro's Ultramarine, which won the Fiction Prize tonight, and Gregory Elliott, who couldn't be here with us, for his translation of Frédéric Gros' Pourquoi, guerre. We're so happy these books are getting recognized tonight. And I also wanted to thank, obviously, Edna Vodka for being our wonderful host tonight, Catherine Fisher, Alessandra Benedicti-Koken, Gray Anderson, sorry, I will switch, and for being here, part of this conversation. There will be a cocktail reception now, and you're all welcome to have a glass of champagne to toast to the two laureates. Thank you very much.